We've been telling a story the last few weeks. My hope is you found your place in that story. Because at the base, isn't that what we want? We want a story. We want to be part of something. We want a story that is worthy of the telling. We're familiar with it in the books that we read, maybe the movies that we watch, where we become drawn into the story and it leaves us with that longing or that ache because there's something that we want in this. We need that big story. And the story that we're so familiar with always seems to begin in the ideal. Right? The happy place, the happy home, maybe the utopian future, the bucolic past. There's a funny word. Right? But we want that ideal story. It's the way that writers, like some of my favorite, J.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, it's the way that they crafted stories where they popularized their fantastical lands. They painted these pictures for us. We see it visually even in the way that some of these books have moved into the films. And I think especially this morning of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy put to film in the early 2000s, and then the prequels that would follow, which did not nearly as well as the first three. But if you're familiar with that story, it starts with the ideal. That place of longing, the Shire, it's called in Tolkien's work. And in the Shire, the hobbits live, very simple people, close to the ground. Pastoral, we might even say. They are simple, they are happy, they are content people. And we watch this sometimes and we long to be that kind of person. We want to be that kind of people because this is a good place for the story to begin. Their homes are built into the landscape. The homes belong. They don't blight the land. They actually blend right into the land. And so their homes are there. Their gardens produce fruits and vegetables that are too good to be true. Right? It all just seems perfect. The children are running the paths. The parents are scolding them as they run past. And a birthday party is being planned, and the whole town is in on it. Doesn't that sound nice? That kind of community life. And we see ourselves in there. We wonder what it would be like to be a part of something like that. That story that we long for. That idyllic place. In fact, in the movies, if you're familiar with them, you'll hear the hints of a song that is familiar to you that I think echoes this sentiment. One of my favorite songs in our Christian tradition is the song, "This is my Father's world." This is my Father's world. I rest me in the thought of skies and seas, of birds and trees, his hands the wonders wrought. Right? This kind of setting. And it's there. And here's what's funny, in case you missed it, and not like a joke, but did you know when you watch those movies, that very song is part of the movie? Listen for it. I'm going to play just a portion of it. Like it should, and you hear those first three notes, "This is my Father's world." The producers of that movie knew exactly what they were doing. It's an on purpose. This is where we want our stories to begin, where everything is right. Everything is in control. Everything is as it should be, and it feels good. In fact, we want our story to begin in that goodness. But how quickly the story changes. We live this life. Our stories are not so simple, are they? Underneath the green pastures, behind the belly laughs, there is something stirring that threatens everything that they hold dear, everything that we hold dear. And very quickly, we are thrown into the middle of a grand story of hardship and toil, of endurance and perseverance, and I think most especially of camaraderie and friendship. And we participate in this, and as we read it, as we watch it, we long for that kind of story in our soul. And finally, when the credits at the end of it begin to roll, the movie comes to an end, or the last page of the book is turned and the covers are closed and the story is resolved and everything is back to how it should be, we are left with an unsettled ache. Because what resolved for them is unresolved in us. And so we look for another story, another epic to lose ourselves into. Maybe the next one will tell a story in a way that I can be a part of it. We long for that story. We long to be a part of something bigger than us. I hear this a lot in the church. You know, we talk about liturgy. Well, why do we repeat? Why do we responsive read? Why do we eat a meal? Why do we do these things? If you do it too often, it's going to become rote and it's going to stop meaning anything. Do you know these are vehicles to invite us into a bigger story? It's the same reason at a ball game we stand and we say the pledge. Or we sing the national anthem. It's a story bigger than us. It's liturgy, in case you were wondering, and we've never complained about that one. Right? But it invites us. Why do we sing about our Star-Spangled Banner? Because it tells a story. And somewhere along the line, we get to be a part of that story. We long for that story. A story big enough to write me into it. One that is meaningful enough to give me a purpose. We can satiate our longing for that story with our quick escapes into grand stories, but in the end, what drew us in is the very thing that leaves us for longing for something more, something that can fit me in, the story. For the last several weeks, we have been exploring the story, or rather several stories of people that we now call our mothers and fathers, our patriarchs and matriarchs of our faith and tradition. And one of the major points of telling these stories over these last few weeks has been to emphasize how broken they were. I know I've told these stories in ways you've probably not heard them told before, but the point is, God built his story out of the brokenness of their story. And part of the message of this for us is that there's room in the story for my brokenness. There's room in this narrative for me. Telling the stories this way is, in a sense, an invitation. Not just to study the past, but to recognize yourself in the retelling. Isn't it amazing how these stories, as sordid and twisted as they become, isn't it amazing how quickly these stories find resonance in our life, where we find ourselves maybe in a different culture, maybe in a different language, maybe centuries and millennia have passed, but still the story is repeated again and again in our lives and in the lives of the people around us. And so these stories have been for us an invitation. Maybe there's room enough for me. But in studying the brokenness of all of these people, we cannot forget the true starting point, the real genesis of the story. Like Tolkien's telling, our story doesn't begin in brokenness. It actually begins in the goodness of what God created. This is where the story began. If you were here so many weeks ago, we started in Genesis 1:1, and God looked at all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. We started in goodness, but that goodness flowed out of the infinite God into a world that was uncreated, a void unsullied by brokenness. So it's easy to find the goodness in all of that because things hadn't begun to fall apart. And we want our stories to start there, but sadly our stories pick up kind of in the middle. We're like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and our stories are born out of brokenness. And sometimes we forget that the real genesis is the goodness of God. So today, as we conclude this series, it seems appropriate that we go back to the goodness of God. We began with goodness, we end with goodness, but something has shifted in the story, as you heard Abby read. It comes from the story of Joseph, and I'm going to retell that story in just a moment. But did you hear Joseph's word? What you intended for evil, God used for good. This is where the story finds new purchase in our life. Because before, the very goodness of God was God just doing something into the nothing of the uncreated realm. But now, God's something comes into the nothing of the brokenness that our lives produce. And this is where God reminds us once again that God's story is a good story. That is what the word gospel means. It is good news. And right at the beginning, let me give you the end. There is room enough for you in this story. There's room enough for you and for me. So we do not dare forget that starting point. In fact, we keep going back to the starting point because we need to understand where we are going by where we have been. I shared this story a while ago. I was writing a paper, and I was quoting a father of the church, Gregory of Nyssa. And lived 1,700 years ago, more than that. And he was prone to saying, of course, in a different language, but he was prone to saying that protology is eschatology. Now, the story I told you was how my autocorrect on my computer did not like the word protology and changed it to proctology. And if you understand proctology and you understand eschatology, which is the study of end things, you find there's truth in the statement. Proctology is eschatology, but the statement is actually protology is eschatology. Protology, the study of first things as a way of understanding last things. Where are we going? We don't need to necessarily figure out what it's all going to look like someday. God has set up the goodness of His grace in the world so that we can look and say, what God intended in the beginning is what God intends for all of creation. Protology is eschatology. That's actually good news. It's a bad grade if you get those words mixed up. But here we are again. Our story does not start in the beginning. We have a different genesis, so it seems. Our lives were introduced to the story in the middle of the conflict. Our beginning seems to be one of brokenness, failure, dysfunction, abuse. I wish we had a word for all of that. We do. Sin. Sin is not just what I do. Sin is the brokenness of the world. It's the effects all around us. We experience it all day, and this is what we are born into. That's it. That seems to be our beginning. Not God looking at everything and declaring it very good. Our beginning seems to be sin. Sin with all of its consequences. But if we will understand the story, we must remind ourselves again and again of its true beginning. This is where we began so many weeks ago, where God had made all things and declared all things very good. We have got to remember that, church. We who stand high on the hill behind our ivory pulpits and high in our ivory towers telling the world what ails them, we have got to remind ourselves that Jesus is the Savior of the world and God declared it good. May our message become good news and not just sniping from the top of a tower. Good news. We have to constantly remind ourselves of this. And so we go back to this kind of beginning. Originally, the goodness that we celebrated was born out of nothing, but now here we stand in our brokenness. And this is where we find entrance into the story today. It's the story of Joseph. Maybe it's your story. I don't think it is, but maybe it is. This is, a lot of times we hear it spoken of as a rags to riches kind of story. That is not the point of the story. Actually, the verses you heard read earlier are the point of the story. So here it is. Joseph is the 11th son of his father Jacob. He has 10 older brothers and a younger one, but when we're first introduced to Joseph, the younger brother is not there yet. He comes later in the story, Benjamin. But Joseph is the son of Jacob. You remember Jacob, the manipulator? That's his dad. And while Jacob's nature had changed, Jacob's very nature had changed and his name had changed. He's now Israel because he wrestled with God and overcome rather than Jacob, the deceiver, the manipulator. He had become a new man. Still, he had some Jacob tendencies. And one of those tendencies actually manifested themselves in the way he treated his children. Here's part of the depravity of the story. He had 2 wives. If you're keeping track, that's at least one too many. Right? And more than that, they were sisters. Oh, yeah. That is the best response I've heard all week. Yeah, and they did not like each other. Can you imagine the home life? And to be quite frank, Jacob preferred one over the other. He fell in love with one and got swindled into the other one. You can read the story. It's just as sordid as every other story we've read in Genesis so far. So now he's got these 2 wives, sisters, and he has one that he prefers, one that he tolerates, maybe, I don't know. And his wives, or rather I should say wife, starts producing children. You know, children were important in this culture. If you couldn't produce an heir, there was a stigma. And wouldn't you know, the wife who could produce offspring was the one that Jacob tolerated. Until the other wife produced one son. And he happened to be the youngest. So he's the baby of the family. He's the son of the wife that Jacob loved. And Jacob coddles him like mothers coddled lastborns. It's pathetic. I'm looking at my mother-in-law. I'm looking at, no. Middle children. Thank you, Jesus. We're the ones that keep the world running. But he coddles them. You know the story. Gives them a coat of many colors. Andrew Lloyd Webber called it the Technicolor coat. He gives them a coat and sets them apart from his brothers. And his brothers, from the tolerated wife, 10 older brothers, would have none of it. They did not like him. They disdained him. They hated him. They hatched a plan to kill him. This is Cain and Abel being retold again, but now we're further down the road where brother is against brother. And so they're going to kill him. They hatch this plan. The oldest son grows a little bit of a conscience at one point, and he says, as they're getting ready to do this, they've got Joseph in a pit, and he says, maybe we shouldn't kill him. Instead, let's sell him as a slave. That's better. So there was a traveling caravan, Egyptians, they put on a for sale sign, and there goes Joseph. They take his coat, they tear it up into shreds, they douse it in animal blood, and they hand it to Jacob and said, your favorite son is dead. Jacob lives the next 20 years, at least, with that knowledge. Joseph is carted off. He ends up a servant in an Egyptian household, and he seems to be a young man of character, maybe about 17 at this point. And somehow he rises through the ranks of the servants, and he becomes the head steward of this house. And the master of the house, the Egyptian owner, puts him in charge of all of the staff and the house itself, kind of the manager for his estate. Until one day, probably multiple days, the Egyptian owner's wife solicits Joseph for an illicit affair. Joseph refuses and runs from the situation. She accuses him of rape. He goes to prison for a long time. As he's languishing in the prison, of course, his character is exemplified. He ends up actually becoming something of a steward of the prison that he was a prisoner in. He's kind of the Andy Dufresne, for those of you that like the Shawshank Redemption. He's kind of the Andy Dufresne of the prison system in Egypt. And so he has some notoriety, and he's been known to interpret some dreams. So one day when Pharaoh has this dream that makes it look like the nation of Egypt is in dire straits, like a famine is coming, he couldn't interpret the dream. Someone says, oh, there's this Jewish punk in the prison. He's been good at this. Let's bring him in. Joseph interprets the dreams, and he says, guess what? You've got famine coming. You've got to prepare. And Pharaoh says, great, you do it. And he went from prison to second in command of the whole nation. And at the time, Egypt was the powerhouse of the world. Here's Joseph now. Now he's planning, he's storing grain, and sure enough, the famine comes, and the nations come flooding in, looking for grain, looking for sustenance. And wouldn't you know who showed up? But 10 older brothers. Of course, they didn't recognize Joseph. He was wearing Egyptian paint, the eyes and everything, not the big beard. That was Pharaoh, but he probably had a cool hat. I want a cool hat. I keep looking on eBay for a Pope hat, but I can't seem to get one. He probably had the cool hat. They didn't recognize him, but he recognized them. And the next few verses and chapters, really what you're walking through is Joseph's internal struggle. He wrestles. He runs off weeping, washing his face. He's toying with them. And there's ploys and there's things. He doesn't, if you read the story, he doesn't know how he's going to react to this. We'd like to think, well, he just forgave him and that was that. No, it's never that easy. The brokenness of our story. Until finally one day, he does reveal himself to them, and the brothers do something that we do in my family. When things go south, we hide behind one of our parents. When the siblings start bickering, they hide behind Jacob, essentially, and they say, well, you can't do anything to us because it would break your old man's heart. And so he doesn't. But the inevitable happens. Jacob dies, and the brothers are left with the second in command of the most powerful nation in the world, who they sold into slavery, who they treated as dead. And so they say, Dad's dying wish. It's easy to speak for the dead. Dad's dying wish was that you wouldn't harm us. This is where we found the story today. This is right where Abby started reading. And Joseph's response finally, through the struggle, through the turmoil, it didn't just happen. Finally, his response comes to that point. Okay, you don't need to worry. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. And now because of your evil, nations are being fed. And he says on there, I will even feed your children and your children's children. What you intended for evil, God intended for good. I like the way Eugene Peterson interprets this. He says, Joseph replied, don't be afraid. Do I act for God? Don't you see? You planned evil against me, but God used those same plans for good. This is the first version of Romans 8:28. Easy now, you have nothing to fear. I'll take care of you and your children, he reassured them, speaking with them heart to heart. Here's the story. Where do you fit in the story? Let me tell you where I fit. One of the biggest influences in my life was my Grandpa Jewett. My Grandpa Jewett. I share his middle name, as does my dad, as does my eldest son, Sherwood. We could have chosen better. I share his middle name. He was a character. I can tell you dozens of stories of his eccentricities, his quirky personality. He was impulsive. He was quick with a joke. He was short-tempered. He was brilliant with his practical knowledge of seemingly everything. He was a slumlord, but compassionate to a fault. He played the organ in my home church, but he loved to especially play the old upright in his antique mall, that old upright that sounded more like a saloon piano. When people showed up, he would put on a top hat and then put on a show. That was my grandpa. I grew up hearing these words, "You are so like your grandfather," and it was never meant as a compliment. And then as an adult, not too many years ago, I learned something that changed everything. My grandfather cheated on my grandmother. All of the kids were grown and out of the house. I was very young at the time. I have no recollection of the fallout that was occurring around me, at home or even at the church where we all attended and where my grandfather taught Sunday school. When I learned about this affair as an adult, I've got to tell you, it shook me to my core. But the hero of the story is my grandmother. She had every right to demand things from him. A divorce, just get out of my house, vengeance, you name it. She was entitled to it because of his betrayal. When confronted with his sin, though, I am pleased to tell you, my grandfather ran from the sin, ran from the affair as far as he could, but that didn't remove the betrayal from my grandmother and what she was entitled to. He hurt her deeply. Instead, what she offered was forgiveness. Now, I am certain that this didn't happen overnight. I'm sure it took a long time for trust to be rebuilt, and maybe the relationship was never the same afterward. But what I can tell you is the gift that her forgiveness for my grandfather gave to everyone around her. You see, I can speak of my grandfather today as still one of my best positive influences in my life because of my grandmother's forgiveness. It was because of her forgiveness, not because he was that stand-up of a guy, but she was that Christ-like of a wife. Her forgiveness gave me access to a grandfather that I might not have ever fully known. Her forgiveness gave my family a way back into being a family that we would have never had. It affected generations of children and grandchildren that continues to this day. And when my sister was going through something similar, where she was victimized by a philandering husband, it was my grandfather who paid the legal expenses that my sister's very unique circumstances demanded. In a sense, he was still making right out of the wrong that he had done, all because my grandmother forgave him. There is goodness that can come out of evil. Where does your story fit into this? This is what the story is about. And it all hinges on one word, doesn't it? Forgiveness. Forgiveness. That is what God does for us through forgiveness. He takes the brokenness. He takes the sin. He takes the depravity of our lives that were motivated by selfishness and anger and vengeance, and he turns them into goodness. Out of the brokenness comes the goodness of God. This is the first story. This is the story we long to be a part of. That moment when God looked at all that he had made and said it was very good. And God still does that in the midst of our brokenness. Not that the brokenness is good, but that God can do good out of the brokenness. But it all hinges upon forgiveness. When our goodness, you see, is twisted by our sin and it seems that nothing good is left, even there we discover that God is still good. This is the story that you are invited to be a part of. Here's your entrance point. You must receive that forgiveness. Here's the participation point. You must give that forgiveness. And here's the discipleship point. You must live it all day, every day. Forgiveness. We think the world turns on commerce and the dollar and business. The world turns on forgiveness or none. This is where life is born, where goodness turns even the evil of this world into the goodness that transforms all of life. This is the story you are invited to attend to become part of. And let me tell you what this story looks like. Looks like a cross. You see, we see in Joseph's story a hint. No, it's more than a hint. A pre-telling of that Christ story. Instead of jealous brothers who sought the blood of their brother, we find an angry and violent world that demands the blood of God's firstborn son. The anger and the hatred of a broken world saw the innocence of Christ and demanded that he pay. So he was delivered up to the violence of the mob, the hatred of the ones he came to save, and the ridicule of all who would see him. He was placed upon a throne that looked like a cross. In the 21st century, that throne looks an awful lot like our insistences that someone else pay. Jesus is crucified on the cross of cancel culture. Jesus is crucified on the adage of superior might makes ultimate right. Jesus is crucified upon the cross of antipathy and indifference. Jesus is crucified upon the cross of a kind of justice that settles the score rather than reconciles the broken. We kill him on that cross again and again, though he died once for all. Do you see? The cross is any place where we enthrone our own ideologies as right and righteous because it serves our own interests. Or maybe make it a little more personal. The cross is the place where getting even is seen as greater than making it right. It is the difference between retribution and restoration. It is the place where I was hurt, so I will hurt you. It is a place where you failed me, so I am done with you. It's a place where you broke my heart, so I will break your back. It's a place where you slung mud, so I will demand blood. For me, here's what this story sounds like. You called me small, and I withered to fit. You spilled my blood, so your throat I will slit. I tripped and fell. You laughed at my fall. Now falling is weeping in front of them all. Now I only rise for the scent of the kill. Now I only climb to get my fill. Now I only breathe to stop your breath. Now I only live to see your death. And in that place where the spikes pierced flesh, I mocked your fall. I cheered your death. In the place where the crown scarred your brow, I heard a cry, forgive them now. So we come to the end of the story thus told. It ends on a hill if our stone hearts grow cold. But if we listen again to words prayed for the fall, forgiveness from you is forgiveness for all. Even for me in the dust of the ground, even for me, the lost is now found. Even for me, the wounds that I grieve. Even for me, the life I receive.